The war in Ukraine changed the world. 1 year, and we talk about war like it's something normal. We shoot down spy balloons over the US. We arm Taiwan, and we know that the confrontation with China is coming. US and Russian aircraft collide mid-air, and the news cycle is full of headlines containing the word nuclear war. Many don't want to believe it, but the world is preparing for war. This is the first part of a series that will go in depth into the subject of the global war that is on the horizon. We will look into the war in Ukraine, how it will continue, how it will escalate, who will be dragged into this conflict, and where fights will happen. We will answer the question how societies will change because of the war, how a modern war economy in the West would function, and what the global consequences are. From the tactical, over to the strategic, and to a global level. This will be the ultimate World War III series. In this episode, we start with the current situation in Ukraine, analyze the motivation of Russia and the motives of the West. We will shed light to the overlooked numbers of both sides involved, so we can see the situation like it is. Not like we want it to be. Something which most media outlets are not capable of. Welcome to Dark New World. 1 year after the start of Russia's special military operation, the front in the east of Ukraine is relatively stagnant. North of Crimea, the Dnipro is splitting the country in half. From Kherson to Nikopol, the front line is not moving an inch. The massive body of water is a natural barrier that makes any movements currently impossible. At Zaporizhia, the biggest nuclear reactor in Europe is still in danger of shelling from both sides. It is a modern and horrifying problem to deal with a nuclear reactor in a war zone. One wrong move could let Chernobyl look like a minor incident. 200 kilometers to the east, we see some of the most intense fighting on the northern outskirts of Donetsk. From open fields to suburban battlegrounds, both sides hold their lines. Unlike in Bakhmut, where at the time of production, it is not clear if Ukrainian forces can hold the city. Russian forces are close to full encirclement of the city, and Ukrainian forces have no longer control to the only highway leading into Bakhmut. Bakhmut is an important, symbolic city for both sides. Up to this day, this is where the most intense and fierce combat has taken place, with tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. And then we have missile and artillery strikes on every major city in the country, including the capital Kiev. This is a war of attrition, and with a front line of the sheer size of a country like Ukraine, you need the numbers to continue this fight. Let's look at the raw numbers and capabilities of both armies. Ukraine has a population of 44 million people, compared to the roughly 140 million Russians. The Ukrainians lack in manpower. And this seems to be a problem in an all-out warfare scenario like this war, especially in a vast and flat country like Ukraine. But if the numbers are against Ukraine, why are they capable of holding off the Russian army? First, the Ukrainians had at the beginning of this war the largest army in Europe. After the annexation of Crimea, the country reformed its armed forces very successfully into a more than capable fighting force. But it was the massive miscalculation on the Russian side that made the conflict of last year possible. Russia's military leaders thought that, like in 2014, they would be able to just rush through Ukrainian defenses and execute their decapitation strike on Kiev. But the Ukrainian army has changed in the past 8 years. Another problem in the Russian army is that its tactical battalion units lack infantry. There are no ground troops to support the IFVs and tanks along their pushes forward. That's why we saw the high effectiveness of ATGMs in the early phase of the war. Hence why they only attacked with 200,000 soldiers. For a country like Ukraine, that's not enough. Russian troops were outgunned and outnumbered. This is when the Kremlin decided to reorganize the operation and shift all its troops to the east of the country. For Ukraine, this was important. To see that Russian forces are fleeing from Kiev gave them the feeling to be able to win this fight. But now, the situation is changing. Russia is slowly transitioning into a war economy, and the recent mobilization gave it the adequate fighting power that it needs to slowly grind down Ukrainian resistance. On the other hand, Western military analysts believe that roughly 50% of Ukraine's military is destroyed. And now, the country faces its 9th wave of mobilization. If you're older than 16, you can join the army. They won't send under 18-year-olds to the front line in Donbass, but at the northern border at Belarus. This shows how dramatic the situation of the Ukrainian military is right now. Ukraine is running out of ammo, equipment and manpower. The only hope for Ukraine is the help of Western nations. Here we run into Ukraine's next problem. European tank arsenals are almost empty. To be able to keep fighting the growing Russian army, Ukraine needs minimum 3 times more the tanks it's receiving right now from Western allies. But most European nations don't have large stocks left to send. Germany is sending the active duty tanks of some of its battalions to Ukraine, not some surplus material. So the help is not endless. And even if enough tanks arrive in Ukraine, you need trained crews to operate them efficiently. The next months will see the war shift in one or the other direction. In scenario 1, the Russians grind down Ukrainian resistance up to a point where the front line will move west. In the other scenario, Ukraine gets the help it needs and will push Russia back to Crimea. Both scenarios will escalate. In this first scenario, Russia is slowly amassing more and more troops in Ukraine to add pressure to the vast front line. One would argue that Russia should be able to push the front line west immediately. But for Russia, it could be wise to stay in the current position and attack everywhere on the 2,000-kilometer front line to force Ukraine to defend itself everywhere. So Russia would slowly wear down Ukrainian troops and equipment until it's weakened enough to really kick off an offensive. Russia has more manpower by now, so it can allow itself its own losses. For them, it's not dramatic if both lose, as long as Ukraine is losing as much as they are. If Kiev falls and Russian troops rush to the Polish borders, we run into the next problem. For Russia, it is an existential fight for life and death. They have a massive problem with their demographic structure, at least in their logic. The whole idea of this war is to bring back the territories and population of its former satellite states and to restore Soviet borders. This includes the Baltics, Moldova, and bits of Poland and Romania. There would be hundreds of incidents between Russia and NATO to escalate this war. And the remaining Ukrainians would certainly not stop fighting. There would be an Ukrainian insurgency, with its roots and support from eastern Poland. The Polish government itself is already arming itself to the teeth. The question remains how the West would react if Ukraine lost the war. If Russia would get through this, other nations would see it as an example how to take over neighboring territories and coming away with it. This could send dangerous signals to states like North Korea. In our second scenario, the Ukrainians get enough support. And while the Russians amass their troops in Ukraine, they are not able to punch through Ukrainian defenses. At some point, Ukraine starts an offensive in the south, with a goal to push through Crimea and to cut off the Russian-occupied territories and split the Russian sector in half. Ukraine stated a long time ago that the reconquering of Crimea was always the goal. The problem is how Russia sees Crimea. It is one of the most important assets for Russia and would cripple the country if they would lose it. In Crimea, Russia has its only port that is not freezing in winter. The Russian government made clear that Russia would use nukes if Crimea gets attacked. Now, the Russian government says a lot, and it's yet to be seen if Russia would do something like this. But the situation would be dire, and it would be painful for Russia to lose this war. Too much is on the table for the nation to give up these territories. And Russia paid a high price already. The government would know if they lose this war, the anger of the people would be directed at them. So the Kremlin has no choice but to succeed in its plan to conquer Ukraine, at least in their sense of logic. And this is the major problem we all face. Both parties have everything to lose. And at some point, one or the other will. At this moment, there is no way that the conflict is not widening. If one side is losing, the war continues and transforming itself into something bigger. The status quo is everything that prevents an escalation at the moment. But it cannot continue forever. So we haven't much time left. In our scenario timeline, Russia is winning. Kiev falls. There is more and more saber rattling in China and Taiwan, North and South Korea holds military drills, and Iran and Israel are threatening each other. In the next episode, we will take a look at the 4 theaters of war in World War III. Because it won't be Europe alone. If there is a wider war in Europe, every frozen conflict on the planet would restart violently. From the Asia-Pacific region to the Middle East and Europe. We take a look at where would be fought, how would be fought, and who would fight who. And yes, China plays a bigger role than you think in all of this. As soon as the next episode releases, I will link it here in the box. Until then, There's a video about Kaliningrad and Europe's plans to defend the Baltic states in a World War III scenario. My name is Dennis. Thank you for watching and goodbye.